Canada, once a beacon of prosperity and stability, is now facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's approval rating has plummeted from 65% to just 28%. With skyrocketing housing costs, a labor shortage, and an immigration system under strain, the country is teetering on the edge. What went wrong, and can Canada recover? Stick around because this story is just beginning. To understand how we got here, we need to look at the current state of Canada. Imagine living in a city like Toronto, one of the country's largest and most iconic cities. The skyline is filled with glass towers, luxury condos, and expensive penthouses, but beneath the shiny surface, a stark reality is unfolding. Rent prices in Toronto have surged so high that it's no longer affordable for the average Canadian. In fact, the rental wage in Toronto was estimated at $36.50 per hour in 2023, well above the provincial minimum wage of $15.50. That means you need to earn more than double the minimum wage just to cover basic living expenses. For many Canadians, this isn't just a temporary challenge, it's a crushing burden that's slowly eroding the dream of homeownership. Take, for example, the story of Sarah, a single mother from Toronto, who was forced to live in her van after being priced out of her apartment. She'd been working full-time in a stable job, but with the high cost of rent, she simply couldn't keep up. This isn't an isolated case. It's a growing trend across the country. From Vancouver to Montreal, average Canadians are being pushed out of urban centers, forced to either downsize or relocate to less desirable areas where jobs and services are scarce. This housing crisis is no longer just a statistic. It's a lived reality for millions of Canadians. At the heart of this crisis lies the Canadian government, led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Once seen as a beacon of hope and progress, Trudeau now finds himself in the midst of a political storm. His approval ratings have plummeted from highs of 65% to a staggering low of just 28% in recent years. This dramatic decline has left many wondering how the leader who once inspired millions could have fallen so far out of favor. As Canada heads into another election year, Trudeau's path to a fourth consecutive term seems increasingly uncertain. What happened? How did Trudeau, who once commanded such widespread support, end up in this precarious position? To answer that, we need to dive into the decisions that have contributed to this crisis. It's not just the rising costs of living or the housing shortage. It's a combination of policy failures, mismanagement, and a lack of foresight that has brought Canada to the brink. And now, with an election on the horizon, Trudeau faces a stark choice. Can he course correct in time, or will this be the end of his political career? To truly understand why Canada is in such a precarious position, we need to examine the structure of the country's government. Canada operates under a federal system, meaning power is divided between the federal government, provincial governments, and municipalities. At first glance, this division of power might seem like a well-balanced system, but in practice, it has created confusion, inefficiency, and a lack of accountability. The federal government, led by Trudeau's Liberals, controls national issues like defense, trade, and immigration. Provincial governments, on the other hand, have jurisdiction over education, healthcare, and property rights. But it's the municipalities, the local governing bodies, that hold the most direct power over the most immediate issues Canadians face, such as land use, zoning laws, and housing development. The problem lies in the fact that municipalities are often underfunded and lack the resources or political will to address the growing housing crisis. When the federal government increases immigration levels, as Trudeau has done in recent years, the responsibility for ensuring there is enough housing falls squarely on the shoulders of local governments. However, many municipalities simply aren't equipped to handle the surge in demand for housing. With limited budgets and outdated infrastructure, they struggle to keep up with the rapid pace of growth. The real issue here is the disconnect between federal policies and municipal realities. While the federal government pushes for increased immigration, municipalities are left scrambling to provide adequate housing. But the problem goes deeper than just a lack of resources. Many cities and towns still operate under zoning laws that are woefully outdated and restrictive. These zoning laws often only permit the construction of single-family homes, which leads to urban sprawl and a shortage of affordable housing options. In major cities like Vancouver and Toronto, this has created a situation where the demand for housing vastly outweighs the supply. Developers, seeing an opportunity to profit, have increasingly focused on building luxury homes and condos to cater to the wealthiest Canadians and international investors. The result? A flood of high-end properties, but very few affordable options for the average Canadian. And with both domestic and international investors pouring money into the market, prices continue to rise, leaving working-class Canadians priced out of the housing market altogether. Trudeau's role in this crisis cannot be overlooked. His immigration policies, while well-intentioned, have only exacerbated the problem. By significantly increasing the number of immigrants coming into Canada without ensuring the infrastructure was in place to support them, Trudeau has essentially created a perfect storm. In recent years, millions of immigrants were granted permanent residency, but millions more were allowed to enter as temporary residents, including international students and foreign workers. This influx of temporary residents has created additional pressure on Canada's already strained housing market. These temporary residents, many of whom are international students and foreign workers, are often forced to compete for the same limited housing stock as Canadian citizens. The result? A sharp rise in rental prices and a shortage of available units. But that's not all. Many of these temporary residents are also entering the job market, competing for positions with Canadian workers, further fueling discontent among the local population. Canada has a long history of embracing immigration. For decades, the country's immigration policies were seen as a key driver of economic growth. Immigrants were welcomed with open arms, as they were seen as a valuable asset to the economy. Canada's merit-based immigration system ensured that those who entered the country were skilled, educated, and ready to contribute to the country's prosperity. Immigration helped populate vast, underdeveloped areas, and newcomers brought fresh ideas, skills, and innovation. But over the years, Canada's immigration policies began to shift. What was once seen as a strength became a source of strain on the country's resources and infrastructure. As the number of immigrants continued to rise, the government failed to adequately prepare for the challenges that would come with such rapid population growth. Under Trudeau's leadership, the flow of migrants into Canada reached unprecedented levels. In an effort to boost the country's population and economy, Trudeau's government increased immigration targets year after year. While these policies were intended to address labor shortages and drive economic growth, they failed to account for the strain this would place on Canada's housing and job markets. The result? A rapid influx of people, many of whom were temporary residents, international students, foreign workers, and refugees, without enough housing or job opportunities to go around. And while these individuals contribute to the economy, the reality is that they are also competing for the same limited resources as Canadian citizens. This imbalance has created a volatile situation, with many Canadians feeling left behind as the country's population swells without adequate infrastructure to support it. The influx of temporary residents has had a profound impact on Canada's housing and job markets. Many international students, for example, have exploited loopholes in the immigration system by enrolling in language programs to qualify for study permits, only to work full-time without completing their courses. Similarly, the temporary foreign worker program allowed employers to hire foreign workers at lower wages and with poorer working conditions, undercutting Canadian workers in the process. These temporary residents, while contributing to the economy, are also driving up demand for housing and jobs. As the number of temporary residents continues to grow, the pressure on Canada's already strained housing market has only intensified. In many cities, rental prices have skyrocketed, and Canadians are being pushed out of the housing market entirely. Meanwhile, the job market has become increasingly competitive, with foreign workers often willing to accept lower wages, further driving down wages for Canadian workers. As the population continued to grow, the demand for housing soared, but the supply simply couldn't keep up. Many municipalities, particularly in urban centers, had zoning laws that only allowed the construction of single-family homes, effectively banning the construction of apartment complexes or multifamily dwellings. This led to urban sprawl, with luxury homes and condos being built in place of affordable housing. Developers, eager to capitalize on the demand, focused their efforts on building high-end properties, catering to the wealthy and international investors. The result? Home prices skyrocketed, leaving average Canadians priced out of the market.
In cities like Vancouver and Toronto, home prices have become so inflated that many people can no longer afford to buy a home. And with wages stagnating and inflation rising, Canadians are finding it harder and harder to keep up with the cost of living. The dream of homeownership is slipping further out of reach for many, and the housing crisis continues to deepen. So, what is Trudeau's plan to fix this mess? Well, his government has unveiled a series of housing and immigration reforms aimed at addressing the crisis. One of the key initiatives is the Housing Accelerator Fund, a $4 billion initiative designed to help municipalities build more affordable housing by targeting what's known as the missing middle, things like duplexes, triplexes, and mid-sized apartment complexes. But here's the catch. These policies are dependent on municipalities actually implementing them. And so far, progress has been slow. Only a few cities, like Vancouver and Edmonton, have made any significant changes to their zoning laws. Even then, the changes have been minimal, and the housing supply continues to fall short of demand. Trudeau's immigration plan has also come under scrutiny. In an effort to ease the pressure on housing, the government has announced that it will reduce immigration targets for the next few years, essentially halting population growth for a brief period. But will this really solve the problem? Can the government realistically expect millions of temporary visa holders to leave voluntarily? And even if they do, there's still the issue of how to address the underlying housing shortage. With an election looming, Trudeau's political future is hanging by a thread. Will these reforms be enough to turn the tide and secure his legacy? Or will Canadians decide it's time for a change? The stakes couldn't be higher, and as the election approaches, we'll be watching closely to see if Trudeau can navigate this crisis or if this is the beginning of the end for his political career. As we look ahead to the next election, it's clear that Trudeau's leadership is in jeopardy. Canadians are frustrated, and many are questioning whether he's the right person to lead the country forward. Will his plans for housing and immigration be enough to win back the support of the people? Or will the mounting crises force him out of office? One thing is for sure: the next few years will be critical for Canada's future.